hurt them in the way that they understand, which is finance and money.
They're mobilizing in Washington, D.C.
I'm here because the IMF right here has caused a lot of problems for the global south. They've given massive illegal loans that have created enormous crippling debt for the global south.
The reality is that the global south is in a lot of debt to the countries of the global north through the IMF. This is colonialism.
These guys, they finance multiple fossil fuel projects around our continent. They are South Africa's biggest lender.
In this ClimateGenn episode, I'm speaking with Sunny Morgan in South Africa about the Debt for Climate campaign that is calling for the global north to cancel the debts of the global south, which are both crippling the economies in developing nations and financing huge fossil fuel projects that we desperately need to get rid of. Sunny outlines how these institutions work with corporations to lock in hugely destructive projects that are destroying natural ecology, trashing the climate, and ruining people's lives. This is a system of corruption that must be stopped as part of the just transition to a fairer and cleaner world. There simply is no place for what equates to a contemporary form of colonialism, and the campaign will be making their case at the G7 meeting later this month in Germany and again at COP27 in Egypt in November. Check out their website at debtforclimate.org. Thank you for listening to ClimateGenn. You can watch, listen and subscribe on YouTube and all podcast channels. To get episodes early and also access additional content relating to the future we are facing, you can subscribe via Patreon, which also supports this project. Thank you. Can we just start? I wanted to ask you, how does a country like South Africa or any other global South country get into this debt trap in the first place?
It's a legacy of colonialism, right? The process of extracting resources and labor through slavery from our continent and then creating this dependence through trade is how we get trapped in this cycle. So we've got the resources. We suffer from this thing called the resource curse, right? But we've never really been given the chance to develop the infrastructure or the mechanisms to manufacture and produce and sell on fair and equitable terms. We're always behind the curve. We are indebted historically. We are caught in the debt trap simply because we have historical obligations that have been foisted on us through generations of exploitation, not only of our labor, not only of our country and our land, but also of our resources.
In the UK and places like that, we tend to think of these things, and you mentioned colonialism, we think of those as kind of historic things that have been put to rest. But really what you're talking about with these debt traps is part of a more widespread mechanism to continue to steal these resources from nations like South Africa. So it is that form of colonialism. Would you say that's accurate?
It's absolutely accurate. The issue of colonialism and the reparations and the debts owed because of colonialism is endemic. It's gone on for generations. The only difference now, it's just that it's evolved. The capitalist system and even aspects of globalization has meant that the dependence and the extraction has not stopped. It's just evolved, and it's evolved under this banner of globalization. But in essence, it's a continuation of colonialism, and some of the activists just refer to it as economic colonialism. So this idea in the West, in the UK, in the US, that colonialism and slavery reparations and climate debt is something of the past, and let's just forget about it and move on. You constantly hear this refrain even when we're talking about apartheid. They say, well, that's 30 years ago. Why don't you just move on? Of course we can't move on because we're living with the impacts of it till today. So it's wrapped a different way, but it's exactly the same thing.
On the extraction side, just for context, do you have a project that's going on that sort of illustrates this point very well?
Oh, absolutely. So in South Africa, perhaps in the last 12 to 15 years, we've embarked on the building of a coal-fired power station. It's actually two projects. They are the largest coal-fired power stations, amongst the largest in the world. Right? In this age when South Africa is the third most useful resource for solar and other technologies, that we still are dependent on coal. Again, back to the resource curse, we have enough coal to last us maybe 100, 200, 300 years if we continue to burn it. So we built these two mega plants, coal-fired, coal-powered, and it's funded by the World Bank. It was funded by the World Bank to the tune of $3.5 billion in around about 2010, against the advice of activists and organizations and professionals that said that it was the wrong technology, it was the wrong plant. And today, that plant is not yet fully operational, but continues to be supported by the World Bank. It's not only technologically not in full operation, it also doesn't have the scrubbers necessary to prevent pollution. So all told, that particular project, which would have cost a limited amount, has now ballooned perhaps 10 times of what it originally was meant to cost. This was through known corrupt tendencies and corrupt relationships. One of the partners in that transaction was the ruling party in South Africa, but Hitachi, the global conglomerate. It was fined in the US, in Washington, DC, for its part in the corruption of that transaction. The World Bank was aware of that relationships. It would not have been rocket science or detective work to put two and two together to come to the conclusion that the partners itself, not only was it the wrong project at the wrong time for South Africa, but that it was predicated on corruption. The World Bank is aware of that relationship today.
This is absolutely disgraceful.
Absolutely insane. It's absolutely insane, Nick. What is happening now? Those projects are not even delivering on the promises made today that it would provide power. We suffer from chronic shortage of electricity in South Africa. We lose approximately 85 to 100 million US dollars a day in power outages. In local currency, it's termed as 1 billion. But international US currency, it's maybe about 85 million US dollars every single day that the power is out.
So you're talking about huge, large-scale corruption that involves the World Bank. If they know about it, then they're involved, and it involves people like corporations. Everything's going in the wrong direction because the climate scientists are now telling us we are currently using up the carbon budget at just under 1% per month, and we've got to phase out fossil fuels with immediate effect. And you've got these projects. You've mentioned the capacity for solar in South Africa. How do you see it in terms of, if the debt was cancelled, how would that impact you? How would it transform the world as you know it, as you see it?
So the transition to renewable energy worldwide is an imperative to keep us below 1.5, right? But let's talk about in the context of Africa, of the global South. Globally, we're talking about a new age. We begin to talk about things like the fourth industrial revolution, when in Africa, many of our communities don't have any access to clean running water, to electricity, or to data, right? So it's really about the different levels of development that are across the world. We can call it for an immediate shutdown of fossil fuels in the global north, but it's not really possible in the global south if there aren't all these levers that we're demanding. South Africa and Africa as a whole hasn't even reached full electrification. So it's really about allowing a certain level of development to continue to take place, but in a very, very equitable and just way. And cancelling of the debt today would firstly contribute to reparations. The climate debt is a known number. We say that that's part of the reparations due. Secondly, it would be an acknowledgement of the unequal distribution or contribution to climate change, but on a more practical note would allow these countries to alleviate poverty and make the climate a priority. If the debt were to be cancelled, then we can leave the fossil fuels in the ground, because what we will do by leaving the fossil fuels in the ground, the burden of the interest payments alone, if we could free up the global south from that burden, we could use those funds, right, to rapidly transition to renewable energy, to increase wages, to create more renewable or green jobs, as you call it, right? So Africa could have its own version of a Green New Deal, and that would be well-paying, sustainable jobs. If we freed of the burden of the debt, we could create those jobs in the green value chain. But at the same time, we could even increase levels of access to basic services like health and welfare. We know how the global north behaved during the COVID pandemic, hoarding all of the vaccines. So there are still large portions of the continent that are under-vaccinated because of the behavior of the global north in hoarding the vaccines. They cannot be trusted to act in a just and equitable way, whether it's health, whether it's energy, whether it's climate change.
Yeah.
So we have to take the bull by the horns, cancel the debt so that we can begin the rapid transition. Because calling for the cancellation of fossil fuels today, the cessation of fossil fuels today, without cancelling the debt, without giving us the climate finance necessary to transition, is a death deal for Africa. How will we then develop?
It sounds more and more, it's like a gross irony in a way of inverted truth, where it's not the global south who are in debt to the global north. It's the global north who, the colonialist nations who owe an enormous debt to the global south. And you're involved in a campaign now to cancel the debt. Can you talk a little bit about that and why people like me and people in my communities should be supporting this campaign?
The Debt for Climate campaign is a very, very innovative and disruptive campaign in the sense that basically what it does, it calls for turning the climate debt into climate action. There hasn't been an innovation like this, we think, before. So how do you directly relate the campaign to this call? If we cancel the debt, the biggest effort we can make is to cease the use of fossil fuels. We think the global north, because this campaign is driven by the global south, right? By Latin America, by Africa, by a growing number of countries in the global south, in partnership, rightfully, with the global north. The Debt for Climate campaign going to be able to deliver practical action. We think that the global north can support it in a way because it thinks about this 1.5 being imperative today. We all agree with that. But in the global south, we're not going to be able to achieve that. In Southern Africa, we're already at 1.2 degrees, and we suffer. We are already suffering. Our scientists have told us that the global south, particularly Southern Africa, will suffer 2 times the global average. So we're probably already at about 1.5, and we are seeing the impact. We had a once-off event a month ago, 1 in 500-year event that took place twice in the month. Before the month was out, it happened twice. It was a rain bomb. In the first event, over 550 people died. More rain fell in 48 hours than would have fallen in the whole year. So the communities that suffered the most, whilst the touristy areas were impacted, the people who suffered the most, the people who were living in shacks and informal housing. In the second event, it exacerbated the damage of the first event because the danger signs were still up from the first event. They hadn't even started to make any of the repairs. And I read a report earlier in the week that South Africa had suffered already in the last year 12 different climate-related events. So the global south is going to suffer very, very, very badly. And we need the global north to come to its senses and support it in credible ways. So the call for the cancellation of the debt must be taken in context because there is the call for reparations, colonial reparations. There's the call by activists led by Vanessa Nakate for loss and damage. So all of those calls are very, very, very important. The Debt for Climate campaign has honed in on the climate debt as a subset, simply because we believe that it makes sense and we believe that it can be quantified, as Rob Callender says, to remove the knee from the neck of the global south that is putting us further and further into debt, but also into poverty and into injustice and into inequality, because we don't have that break that is necessary to take a breather and then to develop in an equitable way.
And it's really shameful to hear that we're sustaining a system that causes this kind of suffering, which ultimately is now creeping up on all of us. It doesn't really matter where you are, and we've all got to move forward with solidarity. And I think a lot of people are starting to realize this. How can we all join forces to support this? You've defined the campaign, but how can we all join forces to support it?
So one of the most important things that you can do, so first of all, is to just make the call popular. So in social media speak, let's say, make the call go viral. Because this idea that it's a separate fight, it's not a separate fight, it's a universal fight at the moment. And the global North activists, communities, society in general, your listeners, your viewers, your following can support it by popularizing the call, talking about it. And then to use, I say this with a lot of respect, to use the privilege that you have in the global North, the privilege of security, the privilege of your whiteness, your ability to be able to go to the BBC's office and lock yourself on the gate, right? And then nicely be told, please leave now. We're going to give you a fine and please appear in court tomorrow. And everything is hunky-dory and nice and neat and tidied and wrapped up. We don't have that privilege in the global South, where some of our activists live in repressive regimes. I say this quite seriously. If I glued myself to a post somewhere at a government office, they're not going to bring the EMS guy to take my hand off. They're going to chop my arm off. And if I get arrested, I'm not going to be released with a warning. I'm going to be lost in some jail somewhere. My family won't find me for days. And I'll face violence inside, to the point that men even get raped while they're in these holding cells. So you have a certain level of privilege in the global North that you can use. You can talk quite openly, criticize governments, the World Bank, the IMF quite openly. So you must use that privilege in a way that it doesn't become your burden, but become your weapon, because you can wield it so effectively.
Okay.
One point is, remember that that there is a campaign at the G7 meeting on the 24th to the 29th of June. Activists from around the world are gathering in Germany, in Munich, to protest at the G7. So make that a call to action to protest. But if you can't make it to Germany, just like I can't make it to Germany, then organize local campaigns in your area. Even if it's just a placard that goes to the World Bank office or the IMF office or the government office, and support the call to cancel the debt of the global South.
So the G7 meeting is the first milestone for activism and public demonstration. Is there other events scheduled for this year where this will be coming up?
Yes, absolutely. So there really were two big dates. G7 meeting is the big date, and then obviously COP27 in Egypt. But in between those two dates, there's a lot of organizing to happen. So we think that if the campaign gets gravitas, goes viral, and we get some recognition around the G7 meeting, then post the G7, we'll be able to organize for COP27. So if this campaign works according to plan, or as it grows organically, we begin to develop the mechanism. So if we do it, we're not unrealistic and naive to think that this call will not happen immediately, but it's a process and it's a multi-year campaign. But we want to make sure that it gets recognition at the G7 meeting and becomes a tool for negotiation at COP27. Officially, at the government level, is the ideal outcome, that government officials who are going to negotiate at COP27 or do the revised NDCs, that they will use this as a negotiating tool. But if that is still not possible at COP27, then at least activists in the side events and in the protests and in all the literature and in the media, push for the campaign to be a negotiating tool, push for that mechanism of the cancellation, and begin to think innovatively of how it will happen, because there won't be one universal mechanism. We may find that as it develops, the mechanism gets developed on a regional decentralized basis, because countries will begin the negotiations individually to differentiate between the odious debt and the beneficial debt. We don't know that there is even beneficial debt at the moment. So we're calling for the cancellation of all the debt.
Okay, look, Sunny, thank you very much for speaking to me. It's a critical climate justice issue. It'll be great to hear again later in the year, pre-COP. I'm planning to be at the COP, so it'll be good to hear how it's all developing, and we can hopefully catch up.
So thank you for inviting me, Nick. Really a pleasure speaking to you.
And you. Thanks again for listening. If you are interested to help support this series and help expand the discussion around climate topics, then please do consider backing my channel via Patreon. It will help me produce more content, and you will also gain access to more expert interviews. It would be great to engage more with audiences too and understand your views on these topics.